Well, the first is we're going to look at carbon dioxide. A strong ventilatory response or a poor tolerance to carbon dioxide means that the threshold will be reached sooner. So you understand that the primary stimulus to take a breath is carbon dioxide. So your central chemoreceptors in the brain or the peripheral chemoreceptors located close to the artery in the neck, they're monitoring fluctuations in carbon dioxide and pH. And they will stimulate you to breathe based on the concentration or the change of pH as a result of the change of carbon dioxide. So when, for instance, you hold your breath, you start feeling, in a number of seconds, you feel that you're not getting enough air. At some point, you'll feel the need to breathe. Well, the feeling that you're not getting enough air is because of an accumulation of carbon dioxide. So your brain is sending muscles for you to breathe based on your CO2 levels increasing. Carbon dioxide exerts a far greater influence on your breathing than oxygen does. Oxygen only stimulates your breathing when oxygen levels drop to about 50%. So it is a secondary effect. And the reason being is because there's such a reserve of oxygen in the human body. So the body and our breathing is very sensitive to even small changes of carbon dioxide. And it's not so sensitive to changes of oxygen. And to give you an example, when you're breathing at rest, you're taking oxygen, it's passing into the lungs, into the blood. It will make a round trip around the body. You will actually exhale up to 75% of it. So you have a huge reserve of oxygen in the human body. So the issue is not necessarily oxygen, but the issue is the tolerance to CO2. Conversely, well, if you have a strong ventilatory response to carbon dioxide, you're holding your breath, carbon dioxide is accumulating. But if you have a poor tolerance to CO2, you're going to start breathing quickly. Does that make sense? Your breath hold time is going to be lower. On the other hand, if you have a good tolerance or a reduced ventilatory response to carbon dioxide, you can hold your breath for a lot longer. So is there an advantage to an athlete having a reduced ventilatory response to carbon dioxide? Think about it. What happens when you start moving your muscles? It increases your metabolic activity. You generate more carbon dioxide. If you have a poor tolerance to carbon dioxide, your breathing is going to increase quite markedly to start getting rid of the CO2. If you can tolerate a large amount of, or a good buildup of CO2 in the blood, your breathing will be a lot lighter and less breathlessness. Less breathlessness translates into a better performance. Because it's not always the limbs which are holding us back in sports. It's our breathing. It's our breathing. So if you can reduce breathlessness, you're going to improve sports performance. And during physical exercise, increased metabolic rate generates carbon dioxide. So having a better tolerance or a reduced ventilatory response to carbon dioxide allows greater physical exertion with relatively reduced breathlessness. So if you have two individuals going for a run and they're doing the same speed, and you find that one individual is breathing a lot harder than the other individual, well, you know, one individual has got a stronger response to carbon dioxide. So if you can train that individual, and by training, I mean looking at his everyday breathing during rest, because athletes, we need to bear in mind that it's the everyday breathing of the athlete that's influencing their performance during competition. And that's completely ignored. How many athletes sleep with their mouths open? That's a problem because they're losing CO2 and it's increasing their response to carbon dioxide. How many athletes breathe using their chest? That's indicative of hyperventilation. How many athletes have low control pauses? Some do. You know, not all, but some do. I've seen some athletes with a control pause of 10 seconds. I've seen one athlete cycling a bike for 120 miles getting blackouts halfway. Nobody looked at his breathing. So if he was getting blackouts, you know that there was severe vasoconstriction. And what's the one muscle that you need plenty of oxygen going to is the heart. So if he's feeling blackouts in the head, quite possibly he's having vasoconstriction to the heart. So he's pushing his body, pushing. But at the same time, there's less delivery of oxygen to the heart. So it's no coincidence that athletes are falling down with cardiac arrest. Nobody looks at breathing volume. How much are these people breathing for a given level of physical exercise? And athletes are used to pain. They push themselves through it. They don't always listen to their bodies. It's not like you'll go for a walk, you'll go for a jog, but you're limited because you'll be listening to your body. You know? There was one Irish GAA footballer, which would be an Irish Gaelic footballer. I think his surname is Stikes, and he became one of the most famous Australian rules footballers in Melbourne. I think he played for St Kilda's. But he had a tumour of a tennis ball on his side, and he never noticed it. And it was his wife that spotted it. Can you imagine having a tumour the size of a tennis ball on your body and you're not aware of it? And that gave me an idea, well, this guy is at the elite of the elite. He's one of the Jim Steins, I think his name is. And, you know, we're not paying the attention to our bodies. And I think it's athletes, they're so used to pushing through pain. Pushing through pain. So here in a study of 7 non-athletes and 8 athletes, it was found that non-athletes had greater ventilatory responses to O2. So when your oxygen levels are dropping, your breathing increases more markedly when you're a non-athlete. And they had a reduced ventilatory response to CO2 when compared with endurance athletes at equal relative workload. So this makes sense. Your non-athlete breathes a lot heavier than your athlete. Your non-athlete has a reduced tolerance to carbon dioxide and an increased sensitivity, a reduced tolerance to oxygen and an increased sensitivity to carbon dioxide. So they breathe far heavier. In this paper, 16 athletes performed light and heavy exercise, and the hypercapnic response independently correlates with ventilation during heavy exercise. So the hypercapnic response is your reaction to the buildup of carbon dioxide. And if you have a strong response to CO2, you're going to breathe a lot heavier. Conversely, when you reset the respiratory center to tolerate a higher partial pressure of CO2, you can do a lot more physical exercise with less ventilation. So we conclude in this paper, in normal subjects, long-term physical training increases aerobic work capacity and decreases CO2 ventilatory responsiveness. And that's exactly what we're doing. So what we're doing is very similar to what athletes are achieving during their sports. But the beauty about what we're doing is completely controlled. You have an individual doing the steps. You're able to simulate high-intensity training, but there's minimal risk because everything is controlled. It's short-term, it's controlled. Do you understand what I mean there? As opposed to sending an athlete out doing intensive physical exercise where they're losing control of their breathing. And the other thing is, to replicate the physiological effects from the steps, you would have to cycle to exhaustion for 2 minutes. If you look at the change of oxygen and CO2 in some of the studies from intense physical exercise, we can produce the same effects during the steps. But in order to do that during physical exercise, it's exhaustion, 2 minutes of cycling to exhaustion. And do you think a sick person is able to cycle to exhaustion? No. That's why the steps are beauty, because pretty much, you know, anybody in reasonable level of health can do it. This paper here, CO2 responsiveness, was found to correlate negatively with maximal oxygen uptake. So here's our VO2 max. So if you have a strong response to CO2, you have a reduced VO2 max. If you have a reduced sensitivity to carbon dioxide, you have a higher VO2 max. So it's a negative relationship to it. And the results suggest that in normal subjects, long-term physical training, as in the present study, decreases CO2 responsiveness at rest. Exactly what we're doing.